This is the third and final part of the coffee table series. First, I just used a folded piece of sandpaper to work away at the really rough spot. Once that started to look good, then I switched over to a much finer grit and used some water to help lubricate. And I just sanded over that spot and then over the rest of the table, thinking those little abrasions would help the epoxy adhere a little better. And I accidentally took off some of the coloring from some of the bottle caps, so I used a Sharpie to try to hide that mistake. Then it was time for more epoxy. This was basically the same process as before, just putting on some epoxy and using the heat gun to spread it around and clear out all those bubbles. The epoxy has dried, but I ran into two problems. The first was just that apparently you should not hug your cat before coming out and working with epoxy because hairs will get everywhere. So it's a little hard to show these on camera, but hopefully you can see this hair right here. And there's a bunch more all over the place. You can just barely see them stand out a little bit. But they are much more visible in person. I think it would be relatively easy to sand down the parts that have the hairs, clean it off, and apply epoxy and get everything good. The problem is basically all the way around the trim, the epoxy is already flush, so I don't know if I can really apply another layer unless I take off a lot, which I don't want to do at this point. And the second problem, I'll show you more closely. If you remember, those trim pieces were pretty warped, and I didn't try too hard to get them perfectly flush all the way around the frame of the table. So I had epoxy that leaked between the trim and the frame, and it's dripped down onto the legs and solidified, so I need to clear that off, which means I'll probably have to sand them again. I decided, since I had to sand down all the legs again anyway, that I'd go ahead and try to apply a taper now. Originally I had wanted to taper the two inside faces of each leg. That's a lot trickier to do accurately once it's already assembled, so I thought I would try to just taper the insidemost corner of each leg. So I initially started with just a small corner sander and didn't make a whole lot of progress, so I switched to a saw to take away the bulk of the material, and then I switched over to a belt sander. I did all of this by eye, so if you look really closely between the legs, I'm sure you can tell that they're not exactly the same, but from a typical glance, they look pretty close. Right, so the legs are done. They don't look perfect, but they look interesting, so I guess it adds character. But I ran into one problem when I turned it upside down, and that is part of the epoxy got scuffed up. I had picked up this random orbit sander just a few days prior to this video, and I thought it'd be good for getting the surface started. I had only used it a little bit on that prototype and a couple other things and was already loving this tool. Unfortunately, I quickly realized it wasn't being as aggressive as I wanted, so I switched to the belt sander and used that to get quite a ways into the epoxy surface. Once that had looked like it was making some progress, then I could switch back to this random orbit sander and start to work up the grits to get a little bit better finish before I switch to hand sanding again to really get things looking a lot better before applying the next layer of epoxy. This time around I was wearing gloves, so I was able to use my fingers to push the epoxy around into the corners and edges. I found that this actually worked really well as long as I kept my fingers down and just kept pushing it and spreading it instead of picking my fingers up and setting them down over and over. After a few hours, the epoxy was starting to congeal, and so I took the tape off. I thought that would be better than waiting until it was completely solid and risking having some pieces of tape getting stuck under it. The next day I noticed that there was one spot that looked particularly bad, and that's because I had nicked the trim with the belt sander when I was being a bit too aggressive, and so some of the epoxy had gotten on there. So I started out by sanding it by hand, and then I decided to put some tape along the edge of the epoxy to keep me from accidentally scratching it when I was trying to clear this up. And then I worked my way around all the trim doing this. So let's start staining these legs yet again. Going to try to do a much lighter coat than I was doing before and see how it builds up this time. You know, I think I had better luck using cloth instead of a brush. All right. There we go. That's a lot better. Then I can apply it really thin and add more coats if needed. But I'm trying to get some of that grain to show through. Now I'm going to use this wipe-on poly and read the directions. Mix container thoroughly. Do not shake. How are you supposed to mix this without shaking it? Maybe swirl? I don't know, whatever. Directions are dumb. Let's get going. Finally, the table was complete. This project took quite a while, and I spread it over a couple of months as I got frustrated and needed to clear my head by working on something else. But it turned out okay. I do a lot of things differently, but I think I learned a lot, and it looks pretty good. And now I'm no longer having nightmares about bottle caps or my tools coming after me.